The king is alone, not by choice, but by necessity. Henry II, a man whose very name had once struck fear into the hearts of kings across Europe, now stands at the precipice of ruin. His empire, built through sheer will and an unrelenting hunger for power, now teeters on the edge of collapse. His sons, the very heirs he forged in his own image, have turned against him. A door creaks open. One of his most trusted knights, breathless and pale, enters. His eyes, filled with dread, meet the king's. There are no words, only the crushing silence between them. The knight finally speaks, but it is not what the king expects. "It is done, my lord," he says, voice strained as if every word costs him. The banner has been raised. Richard has rebelled. Henry's face, usually hard and unflinching, falters for just a moment, an imperceptible tremor, but enough to expose the weight of his heartbreak. His son, the one he had built this empire for, the one he had trusted to rule alongside him, now the architect of his undoing. "I gave them everything," Henry mutters, the words almost lost in the dim light of the hall. His voice cracks, the rage in his chest only barely contained. "I raised them to be kings, but now the very crown he built, through battle, blood, and betrayal, is slipping from his grasp. It will be his own flesh and blood who will tear it from his head. This isn't a battle against foreign kings or an invading army, no. The greatest war Henry will ever face is within the walls of his own home, against the very sons he nurtured, against the family he birthed. What happens when the crown, the very symbol of power, is turned into a prize for sons who would tear their father apart to claim it? The answer is clear. This is no fairy tale. This is a family tragedy, 300 years in the making. A family of kings, each one driven by ambition, each one ready to spill the blood of the others for the throne. And it will not end in glory. It will end in ashes. The question is, will Henry survive the storm his own sons have set loose? The rebellion has begun. Hey there, I'm glad you're here. In today's video, I'll take you through the epic timeline of the Plantagenet dynasty, starting with their rise to power, then moving through their legendary reigns, internal family struggles, and eventual fall. From Henry II's fierce leadership to the Wars of the Roses, we'll explore it all. Comment below and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe for more history stories like this one. If you're not subscribing, we'd love to hear why in the comments. Your feedback means the world to us. In the shadows of history, where power is carved from the blood of kings, ambition plays its cruel game. It is here where dynasties rise, destined for glory, and fall, swallowed by the very force they sought to control. Power. It promises everything, yet it gives nothing without the sacrifice of the soul. And in the world of kings, there is no greater temptation, no more dangerous weapon than the thirst for a crown. There was a time, a fleeting moment, when the world trembled before the house of Plantagenet, a dynasty born not in peace, but in the fires of ambition and conflict. In 1154, Henry II, a restless young king, claimed the throne of England. His reach stretched far beyond the English Channel, his empire growing from the ashes of war and rebellion. With his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, he did not simply unite territories, but bound together the hopes of two mighty nations, France, England, the world at his feet. But ambition breeds monsters. And these monsters, these kings in waiting, were not outside his reach. They were his blood, his sons, And as Henry II would soon learn, there is no greater enemy than the one that shares your name. It began, like most betrayals, with whispers in the dark. Henry's sons, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, each one of them born with the same insatiable hunger for power. They were raised in the shadow of their father's empire, taught to be kings. But what Henry failed to see, what no king ever truly sees, is that to rule a kingdom is not enough. To rule the hearts of your heirs is something else entirely. In 1173, the unthinkable happened. His own sons, fueled by ambition and whispered promises from Eleanor, took up arms against him. The rebellion wasn't born from the edges of the kingdom. No, it came from within, from the very throne room where Henry had sat, watching his sons grow, each one sharpening his claws for the kill. Richard, the brave one, the Lionheart, the one Henry trusted most, had turned. Geoffrey, the cunning one, the one who saw opportunities in shadows, joined him. And John, the youngest, the one who had been sidelined, cast aside as Lackland, was not just a boy anymore. He too had become a threat. This was no longer a battle for land or title. It was a war for legacy, for a crown. Henry, furious beyond measure, crushed the rebellion, his fury burning brighter than any of the flames that had ignited the revolt. But the damage was done. He defeated his sons in battle, yes, but he could not defeat what lay beneath the surface. The betrayal was too great. The trust was broken. The family, his own blood, was shattered. He forgave his sons, but it was a mercy that would haunt him. For Henry II was not just a king of land, but a king of men. And no king ever forgets a betrayal like that. What came next, the betrayal, the wars, the divisions, would be nothing short of catastrophic. Richard, ever the warrior, never truly cared for England. His passion was the Crusades, the glory of battle in distant lands. His kingdom was a far-off dream, a convenient inheritance to fund his ambitions. England, to him, was nothing but a land of taxes, of duties, of things that kept him from his true calling. He was away, leaving the empire in the hands of others, and in his absence, another king was rising. Not from foreign lands, but from within his very family. John, the son once dismissed, saw his moment. He, who had been given nothing, now sought everything. And as Richard fought in the Crusades, John worked in the shadows, using the power of absence to his advantage. When Richard died in 1199, not in glorious battle, but from a simple wound, it was John who claimed the throne. But he was no hero, no conqueror. His reign, from the start, was marred by failure, by cruelty, by an insatiable desire for control. His reign would become a story of lost lands, broken promises, and ultimate humiliation. It was John's disastrous rule that led to the signing of the Magna Carta, not out of any sense of justice, but under duress. The nobles, having had enough of his tyranny, forced him into an agreement that would forever change the relationship between the crown and the governed. A king, forced to bow to the law. It was the first crack in the once mighty Plantagenet dynasty, and so the kingdom, which had once stretched from the northern mists of Scotland to the sunny shores of the Pyrenees, began to unravel. Power, once held by the Plantagenets with a firm, unyielding hand, slipped through their fingers like sand. As history has shown, dynasties are not eternal. They are born from ambition, shaped by the hands of men who seek to carve their names into the stone of time. But dynastic rule, while it may build empires, it also feeds on its own. The ambition that drives men to greatness is the same ambition that drives them to madness. The Plantagenets were no different. Their rise was swift, their rule dazzling, but it was also flawed, built on fragile foundations. From the moment Henry II stood before his throne, his eyes filled with dreams of empire, he was caught in a game far larger than any one king. The game of power, a game where betrayal, ambition, and greed were the true kings. It was a game that led to the destruction of his house, his family, his legacy. And when the dust finally settled, all that remained was the faint echo of a dynasty, once great, now lost to history. The year is 1130 of England, a kingdom that once stood at the threshold of greatness, balanced precariously between promise and peril, is on the edge of a cliff. The death of Henry has shattered the fragile peace his reign had secured. The throne, once a beacon of unity, now sits empty, its legitimacy in doubt. The blood of kings runs cold, and with it, the land itself grows dark. King Henry I's death was the catalyst, but it was his heirlessness that set the stage for the madness that would follow. Henry's only legitimate son had drowned in the White Ship disaster, and his daughter, Empress Matilda, was next in line. But the path to the throne would not be an easy one. England's nobility, fractured and power-hungry, saw in her a queen to be resisted. Thus, the first seeds of chaos were sown. Matilda's claim to the throne was opposed by King Stephen of Blois, a cousin to the late Henry III. Stephen seized the crown with the swiftness of a man determined not to let a female heir take his place. The crown that had once symbolized unity now became the prize of a vicious game, a game that would tear England apart. In the streets of London, the scene was not one of orderly coronation, but of mobs filled with fear and hope in equal measure. Some cheered for Stephen, others whispered for Matilda. It was a kingdom caught in the grip of indecision, and that indecision would be its undoing. The phrase "Christ and his saints slept" echoed through the land, a lament for a kingdom that no longer felt the presence of divine law, no longer adhered to the principles of justice or order. It was a time of chaos, where might made right, and the only rule was survival. The fields of England, once fertile and green, now lay abandoned. The harvest rotted in the fields, left untended by farmers who had fled the violence. Peasants, once the backbone of the kingdom, were left with little more than the clothes on their backs as noble lords waged war, not only for the throne, but for their own slice of land. Castles sprang up as symbols of power, and from these fortresses, men would wage war, not for country or king, but for the spoils of battle. Normandy, once an ally, was now a battleground between Stephen's forces and those loyal to Matilda. And it was in these conflicts that the fabric of English society began to unravel completely. The barons, who should have been the protectors of the realm, were now little more than thieves in the night, raiding villages and fortifying their own castles. In the fens in the north, the conflict went beyond the thrones to the very heart of England. London, the heart of the kingdom, had become a divided city. One half sided with Stephen, the other with Matilda. The political chaos became personal. The people of the city lived under the constant threat of attack. The cries of battle echoed through the streets as each faction fought for control. Entire neighborhoods turned to rubble, their homes looted and burned. Then came the Battle of Lincoln in 1141. Stephen, captured by Matilda's forces, was dragged before her like a prisoner of war, his crown now a symbol of humiliation. The English throne had, for a brief moment, seemed to lean toward Matilda. But, as history often shows, victory was never guaranteed in this war. The people of London, wary of Matilda's power, turned against her. A mob, enraged by her demands, rose up and chased her from the city. The streets once filled with promise now became a battlefield once again. Stephen was released in a prisoner exchange, and the crown returned to his head. The Anarchy, this brutal, senseless civil war, had no end in sight. For years the war would continue, with Stephen and Matilda never truly able to claim the upper hand. For the average Englishman or woman, this was not just a political struggle. It was a fight for survival. Lawlessness became the norm. Roads were no longer safe to travel. Villages no longer safe to live in. Castles ruled the land, not as homes of kings, but as citadels of tyranny. The land was plundered for everything it had, its wealth, its manpower, its resources, until there was nothing left. But even in this desolation, there was a glimmer of hope. For as the flames of war slowly burned out, exhausted by years of relentless fighting, a new power began to rise. The Treaty of Wallingford in 1153 marked the first real step toward peace. Stephen, now weary and broken by years of warfare, agreed to recognize Henry Fitz-Empress, the son of Empress Matilda, as his heir. The hope of England, of a kingdom that had bled for nearly 2 decades, was now in the hands of a young, determined ruler, Henry II. And though the scars of the Anarchy would never truly heal, Henry would become the man to build what the Anarchy had destroyed. The contrast between the chaos of the Anarchy and the dawn of Henry II's reign could not have been starker. When Henry ascended the throne in 1154, it was not just the start of a new chapter for a kingdom, but the birth of an empire. Where once England was divided and lawless, Henry promised order. Where once castles stood as symbols of defiance, they would now stand as bastions of royal law. The reign of Henry II marked the end of a dark era and the beginning of a new age, one where the law would rule, not the sword. It was the moment England began to rebuild, its shattered pieces slowly forged into something whole again. The Anarchy, with all its pain and suffering, would be remembered as a warning to those who would seek the crown without a solid foundation, a reminder that when kings are made by force, the kingdom will always pay the price. It was a kingdom on the edge of destruction. England, torn apart by years of civil war, the Anarchy, lay fractured and broken, like a kingdom of shattered glass, its pieces scattered across the lands. For nearly 2 decades, the throne had been a symbol not of stability, but of division. The death of Henry I in 1135 had left England adrift, his heirless death sparking a bitter struggle between his daughter, Empress Matilda, and her cousin, King Stephen. But in the wake of this ruin, when the kingdom was on the brink of collapse, there emerged a man, a figure born into this fractured world, who would rebuild it from the ground up. Henry Plantagenet, a young man with a destiny larger than his years, was about to rise. Born in 1133 in the quiet courts of Anjou, Henry's fate was shaped by ambition from the start. He was the son of Geoffrey Plantagenet and Matilda, daughter of Henry III. This bloodline, rich in history, made him a natural heir to both England and France. But he was not born into a world of peace. From the moment he could walk, the land around him was one of constant unrest. Henry's early years were spent in the shadow of his mother's bitter struggle for the throne of England. His father's influence in Anjou meant that Henry was exposed to the high-stakes world of power, diplomacy, and war. From Normandy's fortified castles to the dusty roads of Aquitaine, young Henry saw firsthand the price of ambition. But it was not just war he learned. He learned the art of politics. He learned how to bend men to his will, how to manipulate the fractured loyalties of nobles, how to see opportunity where others saw only chaos. By 1154, Henry had already claimed a significant portion of Europe's map: Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine, territories that would form the foundation of his kingdom. But this was not enough. His kingdom was fractured, and a fractured kingdom could not stand. The young Duke was a political genius, his mind sharp and his ambition unyielding. Henry's ascent was no simple feat. The Treaty of Wallingford in 1153 had named him heir to the throne after King Stephen's death. But Henry did not wait for Stephen to die. No, he acted swiftly, seizing the moment. By 1154, just 21 years old, he was crowned King Henry II of England. But in his heart, he knew that the throne would be nothing without power, and power he would need to centralize. Henry's political brilliance lay in his ability to balance warfare, diplomacy, and law in a way few monarchs before him had. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Europe, solidified his claim not only to England, but to vast territories in France. This marriage, which tied together a vast network of lands, was the cornerstone of Henry's future plans. But he knew that land alone could not keep his kingdom strong. The real challenge lay in ruling it. What set Henry apart from his predecessors was his relentless pursuit of order in a kingdom that had known nothing but disarray. His first step towards centralization was the creation of a stronger royal court. He sent royal judges to the far corners of England, where feudal lords had previously acted as their own lawgivers. Under Henry's rule, the law was to come from the crown and not from the whims of local lords. It was a radical move, one that would forever change the way England was governed. The second, and perhaps most daring, move was Henry's overhaul of the judicial system. He reformed the criminal law, moving towards a more uniform and centralized structure. No longer would a man's fate be decided by the local lord or the whims of his noble neighbors. Under Henry's reforms, justice was to be decided in a royal court. This centralization of power did not come without its enemies. Nobles, long accustomed to their own authority, resisted. But Henry was tireless. He pushed on, determined to break the power of local lords and elevate the monarchy to its rightful place at the top of the feudal ladder. He also understood the importance of royal finances. Where his predecessors had relied on the whims of the nobility to fund wars, Henry introduced a more systematic taxation system. He sought to take control of the purse strings of England, recognizing that power was not just held by the sword, but also by the wealth to sustain an empire. Despite his early success, Henry's reign was not without strife. His ambitious reforms brought him into direct conflict with the Church, most notably with Archbishop Thomas Becket. Once Henry's closest ally, Becket became an obstacle when he refused to allow Henry to exert his will over the Church. This bitter dispute came to a head in 1170, when Becket was tragically murdered in Canterbury Cathedral. Though Henry was deeply remorseful, the incident revealed the complex relationship between the monarchy and the Church, one that Henry had tried to dominate. This conflict highlighted the extent of his ambition, how, in his drive for control, he would challenge not just the nobility, but also the sacred institutions of the land. But Henry was not a man to be deterred. He turned his focus inward, seeking to solidify his power through military might and strategic diplomacy. By 1170, Henry had regained most of his land in France and pushed back rebellious barons in both England and Normandy. By the time of his death in 1189, Henry II had achieved what few could have imagined when he first ascended the throne. His kingdom, though still plagued by internal strife, was stronger and more centralized than ever before. He had transformed England into a kingdom where the law held sway and the king's authority was unquestioned. His tireless energy, his ability to navigate the complex world of medieval politics, and his sheer ambition had restored a fractured kingdom and set the stage for the Plantagenet dynasty to rule for generations to come. But for all his success, Henry's personal life was marked by turmoil. His sons, each one driven by their own ambition, would eventually turn on him. The kingdom that Henry had built would not remain secure forever. But for now, Henry's reign stands as one of the most transformative periods in English history, a time when power was truly centralized and the monarchy stood at the pinnacle of medieval governance. Henry II's rise to power, his vision for a united England, and his relentless pursuit of reform marked a new era in the history of the English monarchy. His ambition shaped the future of not only England, but Europe. And though the fruits of his labor would be tested in the wars and struggles of his heirs, his work stands as a testament to the enduring power of vision, drive, and tireless effort. In the court of Henry II, amidst the bright tapestries and echoing footsteps of power, there was once a man who stood by the king's side, his loyalty unwavering, his ambition matched only by the man who had raised him to greatness. Thomas Becket, a humble son of a London merchant, had found favor in Henry's eyes, rising from obscurity to become the king's closest confidant. At first, there was no greater ally to Henry than Becket. In 1154, when Henry ascended the throne, it was Becket who had stood by him, not just as a friend, but as an instrument of royal policy. A man of sharp wit and tireless ambition, Becket became Henry's chancellor, and together they began to rebuild a fractured England. The church had long held influence over English affairs, but Henry, ever the pragmatist, believed that for England to truly be united under a single rule, the church must be brought into line. And so, he turned to Becket, his trusted right hand, to help him achieve royal supremacy over the church. At first, their bond seemed unbreakable. Henry needed Becket as an ally in his mission to centralize power, and Becket, ever ambitious, found in Henry not just a king, but a patron who could elevate him from humble origins to the heights of ecclesiastical power. It was Henry's idea to appoint Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, a move that would allow him to control the church and its influence over English politics. Becket, the man who had once administered Henry's royal courts, now found himself at the heart of the church. And with it, a new set of rules and responsibilities. What Henry did not foresee, what no one could have anticipated, was that Becket, once his staunchest ally, would become the greatest challenge to his vision of royal power. Becket's transformation from a loyal servant to a staunch defender of the church's independence came slowly, but with each passing year, it became more pronounced. As Archbishop, Becket began to view his duties not as a tool of the monarchy, but as a man chosen by God to defend the church's divine rights. He began to resist Henry's attempts to control the clergy, particularly the constitutions of Clarendon in 1164, which sought to limit the church's power over legal matters involving the clergy. Henry, whose ambition was as boundless as the lands he ruled, could not accept this challenge to his authority. He believed that the monarchy and his throne were divinely ordained and that the church must submit to the will of the king. But Becket, resolute in his new role as defender of the church's privileges, opposed him at every turn. What had once been a partnership built on shared ambition now became a battleground of ideals. The monarchy's control over the church versus the church's divine autonomy. The clash between the two men was not just political, it was deeply personal. The king, once so fond of Becket, now viewed him as a traitor to the crown. Becket, once so loyal to the king, now saw his duty to the church as more important than any royal favour. Each word between them, each confrontation, was a step deeper into a tragedy that neither man could fully comprehend. As the tension reached its breaking point in 1170, Henry, in a moment of exasperation and fury, is said to have cried out, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" These words, spoken in the heat of anger, would have dire consequences. It is unclear whether Henry's outburst was a genuine call for action or the expression of a king overwhelmed by the relentless defiance of Becket. But to those around him, especially his knights, those words became a command. 4 of Henry's knights, interpreting the king's words as an order, travelled to Canterbury to confront Becket. The archbishop, steadfast in his refusal to submit to royal authority, met them at the cathedral. There, on the cold stone steps of the church, Becket was struck down in a brutal act of violence, his blood staining the very sanctuary he had devoted his life to protecting. The murder of Thomas Becket was not just a personal tragedy for Henry, it was a national and religious catastrophe. The shockwaves reverberated across England and Christendom. The church, once challenged by the crown, now stood as a symbol of sanctity and divine justice, and Becket, slain in the house of God, was canonized a martyr in 1173. The king, who had once seen the church as a tool to secure his throne, now found himself powerless before its wrath. The repercussions for Henry were immediate and severe. His once unchallenged authority over England was now severely diminished. The church, with the power of Becket's martyrdom behind it, extracted a public penance from Henry, forcing him to submit to the very forces he had once sought to control. Henry, in a desperate attempt to atone for the murder of his friend, made a public display of humility, allowing himself to be scourged as a symbol of his remorse. But the damage was done. Becket's murder had irrevocably shifted the balance of power in England. The monarchy, once supreme, had been brought low by the very institution Henry had hoped to control. The church had won, not through the sword, but through the sanctity of its power, and it would never again be so easily subordinated to the crown. For Henry II, the murder of Thomas Becket marked the beginning of the end of his unchallenged power. Though he would continue to rule over England and its territories for years to come, the relationship between the monarchy and the church had forever been altered. Becket's death had set a new precedent, one that would echo through the centuries and shape the future of English governance. In the years that followed, the monarchy would find itself in a precarious balance, forever reminded of the price of ambition and the dangers of underestimating the power of the church. For Henry, the tragic death of his former friend and ally would remain one of the defining moments of his reign, a painful reminder of how a king's words, spoken in anger, can shape the course of history forever. In the heart of a kingdom united by the ambition of one man, there lay a fracture, hidden beneath the surface of power and grandeur. Henry II, a king whose vision for a strong, centralized empire had reshaped England and much of France, had built his success upon careful calculation, tireless energy, and unrelenting ambition. But there was one thing Henry could not control: the hearts and ambitions of his own sons. The Plantagenet dynasty, vast and sprawling, was not simply a kingdom. It was a legacy, one that Henry envisioned as unified and powerful, a realm of loyalty and shared purpose. Yet, in the quietest chambers of his court, Henry faced a battle that no king before him had fought, a battle not against an enemy from across the sea, but against the flesh of his own flesh. His sons, once the pride of his reign, were poised to fracture everything he had built. Richard, the eldest of Henry's sons, was the one Henry had always believed would be his true successor. Strong, capable, and a born leader, Richard was the lion-hearted warrior, the pride of the Plantagenet family. Yet, his ambition extended far beyond the borders of England. Henry had bestowed upon Richard the vast, rich lands of Aquitaine, hoping it would be enough to keep his son loyal, content. But to Richard, Aquitaine was not enough. It was a gilded cage. The son who had fought beside his father in their early years now dreamed of far greater conquests, of glory in distant lands. Henry's dream of a united, centralized England seemed narrow and limiting to Richard. His heart beat not for castles and treaties, but for the open battlefield, for the crusades, for the honor of the battlefield far from the throne of England. Richard's refusal to align himself with his father's vision began to grow into rebellion. When Henry moved to centralize the power of the monarchy, Richard, ever the free spirit, sought autonomy, not only over his own lands, but over his future. By 1173, Richard had become one of the key figures in the revolt against Henry, joining forces with his brothers, Geoffrey and John, in an attempt to claim the throne for themselves. But Richard's rebellion was not just about power, it was about his independence, his desire to carve out a destiny beyond his father's empire. Then there was Geoffrey, the second son, the one who had learned not the sword, but the pen of politics. Geoffrey was no warrior. He was a master of diplomacy, a man who knew how to weave alliances and navigate the treacherous world of court politics. Though Henry had once entrusted Geoffrey with the leadership of Brittany, the second son's ambitions grew beyond his initial position. Unlike Richard, who sought glory through conquest, Geoffrey understood the game of power from within the royal court. In the rebellion of 1173, Geoffrey was not a man of open conflict, but one of strategy. His role was less about raw ambition and more about maneuvering, playing on the divisions within the Plantagenet family. He allied with Richard, seeking to carve out a place for himself, using the rebellion not to claim the throne for himself, but to destabilize Henry's rule and ensure his own prominence in the resulting power struggle. Geoffrey's political cunning was subtle, but effective. He did not seek a throne. He sought control. Control over the family, control over the future of the kingdom. His participation in the rebellion was a calculated step, not just to challenge his father, but to ensure that he would not be overlooked in the future. Geoffrey's political mind made him the most dangerous of Henry's sons, a man whose ambitions simmered beneath a calm exterior, always watching, always calculating. And then there was John. Young, neglected, and often dismissed by his father as the least of his sons, John carried a chip on his shoulder that would shape his destiny. Henry had always shown a preference for Richard, the warrior, and Geoffrey, the strategist. John was the odd son out, given little territory or power, his role in the kingdom unclear. It was this neglect, this feeling of being left behind, that turned John's ambition into something darker, more desperate. John, the youngest, saw the rebellion of his brothers not as an opportunity for honor or glory, but as a way to seize power that he believed should have been his all along. John, in his bitterness, turned against his father, betraying him at a crucial moment. His rebellion was less about the throne itself, and more about carving a place for himself in a world that had always seen him as weak, as second-rate. But John's betrayal was not a calculated strike, like Geoffrey's, nor a desire for glory like Richard's. It was a plea for recognition, for a chance to prove that he, too, could be a ruler in his own right. His participation in the revolt in 1173 would ultimately seal his fate. His actions, rash, impulsive, and driven by resentment, ensured that John's name would be remembered, not for his strength or his wisdom, but for his failure. The rebellion of 1173 was not simply a war for the throne. It was a war of ambition, of brothers divided by their own desires, and a father who sought to control it all. Richard, Geoffrey, and John, once united by blood, now turned against the man who had given them everything. The kingdom Henry had worked so hard to build, unified by his power and vision, was crumbling under the weight of their rebellion. Henry, a king who had once seen his sons as allies in his vision for a unified England, now found himself fighting not just for his kingdom, but for the loyalty of his own flesh and blood. The rebellion was not a mere clash of arms. It was a battle for the very soul of the kingdom. Henry's dream of centralization, of a united kingdom, was at odds with the independence his sons desired. The loyalty Henry expected from his sons was shattered, and with it, the unity of his realm. His control, once absolute, was now being tested by the very men he had raised to carry on his legacy. The rebellion ended with Henry victorious, but the damage was done. His relationship with his sons, fractured by betrayal and ambition, would never be the same. Richard, Geoffrey, and John would go on to lead their own lives, but the seeds of division had been sown. Henry, the great king who had built an empire, would spend the rest of his reign trying to hold together the very kingdom his sons had nearly torn apart. The rebellion of 1173 was a turning point, not just in the Plantagenet dynasty, but in the history of England itself. It revealed the fragile nature of power. Even a king as powerful as Henry II could not escape the ambitions of his own children. The father who sought to control his sons was undone by the very desire for independence that he had nurtured in them. Richard the Lionheart, the warrior king, whose name echoes through the ages, is a figure whose legend was built not just on the battlefields of Europe, but on the distant, sun-scorched sands of the Holy Land. His reign, from 1189 to 1199, was defined by one singular purpose: conquest. The very essence of Richard's kingship was military glory, and when he ascended to the throne in 1189, it was not with the thought of ruling England, but of leaving his mark on the world, of becoming the hero of the Crusades. For Richard, England was never the heart of his kingdom. It was merely a base, a place to hold his power, while his true ambitions lay elsewhere, beyond the walls of Westminster. His heart beat for the Crusades, for the chance to reclaim Jerusalem from the infidels and to make his name synonymous with divine victory. And so, without hesitation, Richard, alongside other mighty monarchs like King Philip II of France and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, set sail for the Levant in 1190, leaving England in the hands of others. The Third Crusade was more than a military campaign. It was the defining moment of Richard's reign. From the moment he set foot in the Holy Land, Richard was not just a king. He was a warrior in the truest sense of the word. His legendary military career would be defined by his brilliance on the battlefield, his ability to inspire his men, and his unwavering determination to achieve victory, no matter the cost. At the Siege of Acre in 1191, Richard's leadership and tactical genius shone through. The city, a key stronghold held by the Muslims, was a prize worth the fight. Richard's forces, though outnumbered, broke through the defenses, securing a critical victory that would turn the tide of the crusade in favor of the Christians. His actions at Acre earned him a reputation that spread far beyond the Holy Land. Richard was the Lionheart, a king whose courage was unmatched. But Richard's brilliance wasn't without its darker side. His ruthless treatment of prisoners at Acre, ordering the mass execution of 2,700 Muslim soldiers, stained his reputation among some contemporaries. Yet, for Richard, it was never about the ethics of war. It was about victory, about making his mark in history, about the unyielding belief that he was acting in the service of God. As Richard's star burned brightly in the Holy Land, England, the very kingdom that had crowned him, was left to flicker in the shadows. Richard's absence wasn't a brief campaign. It stretched into years of neglect. For nearly a decade, England was ruled by regents, advisors, and those who lacked the king's presence, vision, and authority. Richard, the king of battlefields, had turned his back on the land that gave him power. His kingdom was a distant thought, while Jerusalem beckoned with its promise of eternal glory. England, without its king, began to suffer. Richard's younger brother John, ever resentful of his position as the heir to the throne, saw the power vacuum and seized his opportunity. John's plotting, his ambitions for the throne, took root in Richard's absence. England, once united under the Plantagenet banner, was now fractured by sibling rivalry and political maneuvering. But even beyond John's ambitions, other forces worked to weaken Richard's holdings. Philip II of France, a longtime rival of Richard's, saw his chance. With Richard fighting in the east, Philip steadily undermined English control in France, claiming territories like Normandy that had once been firmly in the hands of the English. When Richard finally returned to England in 1194, his long-awaited homecoming was far from triumphant. Captured on his journey home by the Duke of Austria, Leopold V, Richard was handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI. For months, England was without its king, and the ransom demanded for Richard's release was staggering, 150,000 marks. The price of his freedom plunged England into financial crisis, and the common people, already burdened by the heavy taxes of the Crusades, now found themselves paying for their king's return. Richard's release in 1194 marked the return of a king, but the kingdom he returned to was no longer the same. England had been drained of its resources, its barons restless, and its territories weakened. The empire Richard had once commanded was slipping through his fingers. His absence had not just depleted England's wealth, it had shattered its political stability. England, for all its might, was now a kingdom at the brink of collapse. Richard's reign, vibrant and ambitious, came to an untimely end in 1199. While besieging the French town of Charles-Chabrol, Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt. The wound, though initially treatable, became infected, and within weeks, Richard died at the age of 41. His death was sudden, his kingdom fragile, and his legacy unfinished. The king, who had left his mark on the Crusades, now left behind a kingdom vulnerable and fractured, and a legacy that would be further defined by the chaos that followed. England, still reeling from the economic strain of Richard's absence, would be left to his brother John, a man who would never gain the same respect or love from his people. The kingdom, though powerful in theory, was weakening in practice, and the consequences of Richard's neglect would be felt for generations. Richard's reign was a paradox. On the one hand, he was a hero, a larger-than-life character whose exploits in the Crusades earned him eternal glory. His military brilliance, his unshakable courage, and his strategic mind ensured that his name would live on through the centuries. Yet, for all his military triumphs, Richard's reign was marred by a profound cost: the neglect of England, the neglect of the very kingdom that had given him his power. Richard the Lionheart may have been a legend, but his story is also a cautionary tale. The king who sought glory on the battlefield left behind a kingdom torn by neglect, a legacy forever shaped by his absence. His reign was defined by battle, but it was also defined by the price of ambition. Glory can be won, but it cannot replace the kingdom left in the shadows. While Richard the Lionheart was off fighting for glory on foreign shores, England, his very kingdom, was left to fall apart. Imagine a kingdom left vulnerable, its people paying the price for his absence. Could a king, consumed by the pursuit of fame, have done more to secure his legacy at home? What if he'd chosen his kingdom over his conquest? If you're learning from the past, don't let your ambition blind you to what truly matters. Stay with us to uncover how this one choice changed everything for the future. Don't miss the rest of this epic story, because the price of glory isn't always what you expect. Hit that subscribe button now. Let's dive deeper. In the shadow of great kings, there are those whose names fade into oblivion, not for lack of ambition, but for their inability to grasp the weight of the crown they inherited. King John of England, the youngest son of Henry II, was one such king. Born into a family of giants, Richard the Lionheart, the Crusader king, and Henry II, the masterful ruler. John was always destined to walk in the shadows of his brothers, but it was his choices, his ambition, and his ignorance that would lead England into a devastating spiral of ruin. When Richard the Lionheart, John's elder brother, passed away in 1199, the throne fell to John. But what should have been a moment of triumph quickly revealed itself as the beginning of a kingdom's unraveling. The realm that Richard had left behind, while still mighty, was fractured. Normandy, the heart of their empire in France, was on the brink of collapse. And John, rather than stepping into the role of a wise and steady king, found himself overwhelmed by a task far greater than he had ever expected. He had not been prepared to rule, and the kingdom he inherited demanded more than what he could offer. John's leadership style was erratic, a toxic mix of cruelty, greed, and reckless decisions that pushed his barons and his people to the edge. The most devastating blow came swiftly, and it came from the one place where John's father and brother had once ruled with near total power, Normandy. The region that had symbolized the Plantagenets' dominance in France, the jewel in their crown, was now slipping through John's fingers. By 1204, under John's careless rule, the French king, Philip II, had seized Normandy. The loss wasn't a single catastrophic battle, but the result of years of neglect. John's inability to maintain strong relationships with the French nobility, coupled with his desperate attempts to cling to power, led to the inevitable collapse. And just like that, the vast empire built by his family was fractured. For John, the loss of Normandy was not just a political failure, it was personal. The kingdom he had inherited, the very legacy of his ancestors, had been broken by his inability to manage it. His enemies, both in France and at home, began to close in. But it wasn't just his military failures that defined John's reign. His cruelty and mismanagement became legendary, and not in a way that earned respect. John ruled with an iron fist, his every action a reflection of his desperation to cling to power. His subjects, once loyal to the crown, began to fear him as much as they despised him. One of the most infamous moments of his reign came in 1205, when John, in a fit of paranoia and desperation, had his nephew Arthur of Brittany imprisoned. Fearing that Arthur might challenge his throne, John's actions escalated to murder. Arthur was never seen again, his disappearance adding to the already mounting fury against John. His cruelty extended beyond his family, affecting even the barons who once supported him. John's relationship with the church, too, was marked by conflict. His refusal to abide by papal decrees and his constant interference in ecclesiastical matters only worsened his position. By 1209, John was excommunicated by Pope Innocent III, further isolating himself from Europe and his own people. The kingdom was spiraling, and as his barons grew increasingly disillusioned with his reign, the foundations of his rule began to crumble. By 1215, the simmering tensions reached their boiling point. John's barons, those who had once sworn fealty to him, now found themselves at odds with a tyrant king. His unchecked rule had alienated them. His heavy taxes, his cruelty, his disastrous military failures had pushed them to the brink. In the summer of 1215, the rebellion came. The barons, demanding a king who would rule by law, not by whim, presented John with a document that would change the course of history, the Magna Carta. For the first time, a king was forced to recognize that his power was not divine, not absolute, that even the monarch must answer to the people. On June 15, 1215, John, desperate and cornered, signed the Magna Carta at Runnymede. It was not an act of respect for the rule of law. It was a desperate attempt to buy time. John knew the document would limit his power, but he had no choice. The barons, for the moment, had won. But John's betrayal was swift. Almost immediately, he sought to annul the Magna Carta, plunging England into civil war once more. His disregard for the agreement only deepened the rift between him and his barons, leading to a complete breakdown of his authority. John's final years were a desperate attempt to hold on to a throne that had slipped from his grasp. His reign, already marred by failure, became even more chaotic as he faced a French invasion led by Louis of France, who had been invited by John's own barons. John's health began to fail him. His body, weakened by years of stress, cruelty, and misrule, could not withstand the burden of a crumbling empire. In October of 1216, John died from dysentery at the age of 49, not on a battlefield, but in a damp, lonely camp near Newark Castle. The kingdom he had ruled for 17 years had been left in shambles. His son, Henry III, would ascend the throne, but the damage had been done. The reign of John had left a mark on England that would take generations to heal. King John's reign serves as one of the most tragic tales in English history. His failure to hold Normandy, his cruelty, his disregard for the law, and his ultimate betrayal of the barons led to a kingdom torn apart. The Magna Carta, born out of rebellion, became his legacy, not for his greatness, but for his failure. John's story is a cautionary tale of unchecked greed, ambition, and incompetence. It is the story of a king who squandered his birthright, who ruled not with wisdom, but with fear, and who brought his kingdom to the brink of collapse. His reign reminds us that no ruler, no matter how powerful, is invincible. His inability to balance ambition with responsibility cost him his crown and his legacy. As the shadows of John's reign faded, a new era began in England, one that would be shaped by the lessons of his failures. The Magna Carta, though only a small step in the evolution of governance, would eventually become the foundation for the rights of individuals, limiting the power of kings and paving the way for modern constitutional law. John's reign ended in disgrace, but the seeds of a new England were sown in the very rebellion that sought to topple him. John's legacy, written in failure and defeat, remains an enduring reminder that power must be wielded with wisdom, compassion, and respect for the law, or else it will crumble under its own weight. Edward Bligh stood as a king with an unrelenting drive, a vision of a united, unchallenged kingdom, a realm where no land, no people would defy his will. But it was Wales, the rugged, defiant land to the west, that would test the very limits of his ambition. While England stood firmly under his grasp, Wales had long resisted English dominance, and for Edward, the idea of such resistance was unacceptable. The Welsh had long been a thorn in the side of English rule, fiercely holding on to their independence despite repeated attempts to break their will. The land itself seemed to fight back, mountains and valleys that kept even the mightiest armies at bay. But Edward, a king hardened by war and steely ambition, had made up his mind. Wales would bow to England, and Edward would make sure the world saw that the Welsh would never again rise against him. When Edward ascended the throne in 1272, his mind was already set on expanding English dominance. Having inherited a kingdom of considerable power, Edward turned his attention westward, knowing that Welsh resistance was a thorn in his side. The winds of conflict had blown through Wales for centuries, but now, under the rule of Edward, the English would no longer tolerate the defiance of a people who refused to bend. The Welsh, led by Prince Llewellyn ap Gruffudd, had been the most formidable resistance force, fiercely defending their autonomy. Llewellyn's victories against English forces had made him a symbol of Welsh independence, and his growing power was something Edward could not ignore. Edward's approach was simple: crush the spirit of the Welsh with the weight of English might, and do so with a permanence that could never be undone. Edward's first major military campaign against Wales came in 1277, a year after Llewellyn's rise to power. The Welsh prince, despite his strong leadership, could not stand against the might of Edward's well-equipped army. Edward's forces quickly cornered Llewellyn, forcing him into a humiliating surrender. Llewellyn's realm was stripped, his power broken. But Edward's victory wasn't just about subjugating one prince, it was about sending a message. Wales, as it had been, would no longer exist. However, despite Llewellyn's defeat, the Welsh spirit was not so easily quashed. The land was still alive with resistance, and the hope for independence still burned in the hearts of the Welsh people. Edward knew that as long as Llewellyn lived, there would be unrest, and so he would have to act with an iron fist, stamping out any flicker of rebellion for good. To truly break the spirit of the Welsh, Edward needed more than just military victory. He needed something that would last, something that would remind them, day in and day out, that their land, their hopes, and their futures were no longer their own. And so, Edward turned to stone. Caernarfon, Harlech, and Conwy. 3 castles, each more than just fortresses. They were physical manifestations of Edward's absolute control over Wales. These castles weren't just places to garrison troops. They were symbols of Edward's dominance. Their towering walls, their strategic locations, their sheer size. Each one was a reminder to the Welsh of the power that had conquered them. Edward made sure that these castles were not just military strongholds, but symbols of his unrelenting rule. Caernarfon Castle, with its imposing towers, was built at the very heart of Gwynedd, Llewellyn's homeland. Edward, ever the strategist, understood the power of symbolism. The castle was placed at the site of a former Welsh stronghold, and the grand design of its walls and towers was meant to show the Welsh who truly ruled the land. It was here, in this fortress, that Edward would one day crown his son, the Prince of Wales, cementing his legacy of dominance. Harlech Castle, perched atop cliffs overlooking the Irish Sea, was another stroke of genius. Its location was not just strategic, it was psychological. The Welsh, seeing Harlech's towering presence, could not escape the sense of isolation it symbolized. Harlech, along with Caernarfon, became a daily reminder that their fight for independence was lost, that their land, their identity, was now forever marked by the English crown. Even with the castles, even with the overwhelming might of Edward's forces, the Welsh would not surrender quietly. By 1287, the flames of rebellion sparked once again. Llewellyn's death in 1282 had not extinguished the fire of resistance. It had only passed the torch to his brother, Dafydd ap Gruffudd, who took up the mantle of defiance. Dafydd, despite the odds, led a final desperate charge against Edward's forces, but it was a battle already lost before it even began. Dafydd's rebellion was crushed, and the Welsh were left with no choice but to accept English law. Yet, even in defeat, the legacy of defiance remained. The castle stood tall, but they could never completely erase the memory of the Welsh resistance, a memory that would haunt Edward and his successors for generations. By the time of Edward's death in 1307, Wales was firmly under English control. But even as Edward had secured the land, the castles he built, those towering monoliths of English power, stood as a testament to his victory. Yet, in their shadows, the Welsh spirit had not been entirely crushed. The land may have been subdued, but the pride of the Welsh people, their history, and their culture could not be erased by stone walls. Edward's reign over Wales was one of military brilliance, but also one of ruthless oppression. His desire for control was absolute, and in the construction of his castles, he sought to leave behind a legacy of domination. But as we look upon the ruins of these castles today, at Caernarfon, at Harlech, we are reminded that no empire, no matter how powerful, can truly erase the heart of a people. Edward's castles may have stood as symbols of his triumph, but they also became symbols of the enduring strength of the Welsh, whose spirit would never be fully conquered. Edward the Fierce conquest of Wales stands as a monumental achievement, a testament to his military genius and strategic vision. But the castles he built, intended to be the ultimate symbol of English power, are now relics of a time long past. They stand not only as a reminder of Edward's ambition, but also of the resilience of those he sought to dominate. The Welsh, though defeated, left a legacy that would not be easily erased. The castles of Edward, for all their grandeur, became symbols not of complete victory, but of a struggle that would never be forgotten. And in the end, that struggle, the fight for identity, for autonomy, for a sense of belonging, is what remains in the stone of the castles that still rise above the Welsh landscape today. Edward I, the mighty King of England, whose name would forever be etched into the chronicles of history, was not a ruler known for subtlety. His ambitions were as vast as the lands he sought to control, and when he turned his eyes northward to Scotland, he saw not a kingdom of people, but a challenge, one that would test the very limits of his power. Scotland, a land of mountains and mist, had always resisted the will of kings, and for Edward, the subjugation of this fierce nation was a matter of pride, a matter of destiny. Edward was a king forged by war, a monarch whose military exploits had earned him the title Hammer of the Scots. Yet, it was not just military prowess or brute strength that would determine the fate of Scotland. It was a single object, a symbol of ancient power that would drive Edward's obsession and seal his fate. That object was the Stone of Scone, the heart of Scottish kingship. The Stone of Scone had been a symbol of Scotland's royal authority for centuries. It was the very foundation upon which Scotland's kings had been crowned, an object so tied to the soul of the nation that its loss was felt deeply by every Scotsman. To Edward, however, the stone was not just a symbol, it was a prize. To possess it would be to claim the very heart of Scotland, to crush its spirit and leave it without its most sacred relic. And so, Edward made the stone his goal, seeing in it not just a trophy, but the key to breaking Scotland's resolve. In 1296, Edward's army marched into Scotland, and with brutal force, he seized the Stone of Scone, bringing it back to England. The stone, once a sacred object in the Abbey of Scone, now sat in Westminster Abbey, an emblem of English domination. To Edward, it was a triumph. But to the Scots, it was nothing short of sacrilege. The very act of removing the stone from their land was a wound that would never heal, an affront to their identity, to their very essence. Edward's military campaign in Scotland was not just about the stone, it was about conquest, about imposing English rule on a land that had resisted for centuries. After his initial victories, Edward demanded that the Scottish nobles submit to him as their overlord, stripping them of their authority and imposing English law. His presence in Scotland was both a military and legal conquest. For Edward, victory in battle was only the beginning. He sought to reshape Scotland itself, to break its will through both force and legislation. But the Scottish nobles were no more willing to bend than the land itself. They refused to accept Edward's rule, and as the years passed, their resistance grew stronger. Edward, ever the strategist, sought to quash this defiance with an iron fist, subjugating the land through violence and intimidation. The cities were sacked, the castles were taken, and the people were crushed under the weight of English authority. Yet, even as Edward's army swept across the countryside, Scotland's spirit refused to break. The rebellion was not over. It had only just begun. In 1297, a spark ignited that would turn the tide. William Wallace, a man whose name would become legend, rose to lead the Scots in defiance of Edward's tyranny. Wallace, a figure of humble origins, emerged as the symbol of Scotland's fight for freedom. With his sword in hand, Wallace inspired a nation. The Scots, driven by the memory of their lost freedom, rallied behind him. The Battle of Stirling Bridge, fought on September 11, 1297, was a turning point. Wallace and his men, outnumbered and outgunned, used the narrow bridge to their advantage, luring Edward's forces into a trap. The victory was nothing short of miraculous. It sent shockwaves through England. For the first time, Edward's grip on Scotland seemed to waver. Edward, furious at the defeat, did not relent. In 1298, he gathered a massive army to crush Wallace and the Scottish rebellion once and for all. At the Battle of Falkirk, Edward's forces proved too much for Wallace's smaller army. Wallace, though heroic in his stand, was forced to retreat, and his forces were decimated. Edward's retribution was swift and merciless. Scotland, once again, fell to his iron will. But even as Edward crushed the Scots, the Stone of Scone remained a festering wound in the hearts of the Scottish people. The English king had conquered their land, their castles, their cities. But the spirit of the Scots refused to be broken, and the Stone of Scone, once the symbol of their kingship, became a rallying cry for those who would continue to resist. Edward IV's campaign in Scotland was brutal, decisive, and ruthless. Yet, for all his victories, for all the castles he took, and the land he seized, Scotland remained defiant. His obsession with the Stone of Scone, though it symbolized his power, also became a symbol of his failure. The stone, taken from the Scots, was not a symbol of English triumph. It was a reminder of the English king's inability to subjugate Scotland completely. It was a constant, painful reminder that even the greatest of kings could not crush the heart of a nation. In the years that followed, the Scots would continue their fight for independence. The Stone of Scone, though it remained in England, would become a symbol of Scotland's enduring spirit. Edward, for all his might, had failed to understand one simple truth. No matter how many battles he won, no matter how many castles he took, Scotland would never be his, so long as its people refused to yield. Edward III's obsession with Scotland and the Stone of Scone ultimately cost him. His brutal campaign, his relentless drive to control, left Scotland in ruins. Yet it also left a legacy of rebellion that would outlast his reign. The Stone of Scone, though it was eventually returned to Scotland centuries later, would forever symbolize the price of Edward's ambition. In the end, it was not the English king's power that endured. It was the unyielding spirit of the Scots, a spirit that refused to be crushed under the weight of English domination. Edward III, in his relentless pursuit of Scotland, had sown the seeds of his own downfall. He had fought for control, but in the process, he had created a legacy of resistance. one that would echo through the halls of history for centuries to come. In 1307, Edward II inherited a kingdom still reeling from the greatness of his father, Edward the Hammer of the Scots. His father's legacy loomed large, a man whose victories in battle had cemented England's power on the European stage. But for Edward II, the crown was a heavy burden. He was not made for war. He was not a man of battle like his father. Instead, Edward was a king who preferred the comforts of the court, the company of his friends, and the indulgences of the palace. To lead, to govern, to inspire. These were the qualities he lacked, and yet they were the very things that were demanded of him. Edward II was a king who could never step out of the shadow of his father. Where Edward I had commanded loyalty through strength, Edward II commanded little more than pity. His reign, from the moment he ascended the throne, was marked by a constant struggle. A king who lacked the authority to rule, and in many ways lacked the will to try. The early years of Edward II's reign should have been a time to assert his power, to bring stability to his kingdom. But instead, his reign was defined by weakness and indecision. Edward's relationship with the English barons, those who held the true power in the kingdom, was shaky at best. His inability to gain their respect was evident from the start. He failed to surround himself with advisors who could guide him, and instead relied on Piers Gaveston, a young knight of humble origins. Gaveston's presence at court caused immediate outrage among the barons. They saw this upstart, this mere commoner, elevated to the position of Edward's closest confidant, as an affront to their authority. But Edward, blindly devoted to Gaveston, refused to recognize the political consequences of his favoritism. His court became a theater of indulgence, where the king was more concerned with his affection for his favorite than with the pressing matters of state. This favoritism toward Gaveston and the consequent alienation of his barons set the stage for rebellion. The barons, resentful of the king's lack of leadership and the growing influence of Gaveston, began to demand change. But Edward, unwilling or unable to stand firm against the powerful nobles, allowed their grievances to go unanswered. In 1311, the ordinances of 1311 were presented to Edward, demanding that he relinquish some of his royal powers to a council of barons. These ordinances were not a simple request. They were a clear challenge to his authority. In a moment that would define his reign, Edward, instead of asserting his royal prerogative, agreed to these demands. His surrender to the barons was seen not as a diplomatic compromise, but as a king's unwillingness to defend his crown. It was a humiliating defeat for Edward, but it was also the beginning of a dangerous pattern: Edward's inability to defend his power. His failure to confront the rebellion head-on was a sign of things to come. The barons, seeing his weakness, continued to push further, demanding the removal of Gaveston, who had become the symbol of everything they despised about Edward's reign. In 1312, Gaveston was captured by the barons, and in a brutal act of revenge, he was executed, an act that marked Edward's first great loss of power. Edward's reign continued to unravel after Gaveston's death. The execution of his beloved friend was a blow to Edward, but it was also the start of a larger, more dangerous conflict, one that pitted Edward not just against his barons, but against the very idea of kingship itself. Unable to rally his forces and unwilling to assert his authority, Edward became a puppet of those around him. His weakness invited not just the rebellion of the barons, but the growing influence of those closest to him. In 1314, Edward's failures on the battlefield became painfully evident at the Battle of Bannockburn. His army, vastly outnumbering the Scots, was crushed by the forces of Robert the Bruce. The defeat was devastating, not only for Edward's military prestige, but for his ability to command respect. The loss at Bannockburn was more than a military failure. It was a clear sign that Edward, the king, was incapable of leading his men to victory. His failure to defend his kingdom against a determined Scottish army was the final blow to his credibility as a ruler. As Edward's reign continued to spiral, the seeds of his ultimate downfall were being sown by those closest to him. Isabella of France, Edward's queen, had once been his ally, but over time, her frustration with his inability to lead grew. She found a powerful partner in Roger Mortimer, a man whose ambition matched her own. Together, they plotted to remove Edward from the throne. They saw an opportunity to seize power, and in 1326 they acted. Isabella and Mortimer's invasion of England marked the end of Edward II's reign. The king, isolated and powerless, was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Edward III. The man who had once been crowned with so much promise now found himself imprisoned, his reign a tragic tale of missed opportunity and unfulfilled potential. Edward II's final years were marked by captivity and humiliation. His reign, defined by mismanagement and weakness, ended in disgrace. The king, who had inherited the throne with the weight of his father's legacy, now left behind a kingdom fractured by rebellion and betrayal. His obsession with his favorites, his failure to command the respect of his barons, and his inability to rise to the demands of kingship had all led to his downfall. In the end, Edward II's legacy is not one of strength or triumph, but of failure. He was a king who could not govern, a man who was unable to protect his kingdom or defend his throne. His reign serves as a stark reminder of the price of weakness, the consequences of a king who could not rise to the responsibilities of his crown. Edward II may have worn the crown of England, but he never truly ruled it. His inability to navigate the complex political landscape of his time, his failure to stand firm against his enemies, and his obsession with personal favorites led to his eventual fall. His legacy, left in the hands of his son, Edward III, is one of lessons learned. A kingdom fractured by the failings of its king. Edward II's reign is a tragic tale, one of missed opportunities, broken alliances, and the price of a weak king who failed to understand the true nature of power. The ground beneath England's feet had always been fragile, but in the mid-15th century it cracked wide open. The Wars of the Roses, lasting from 1455 to 1485, were more than just a series of bloody battles between rival factions. They were the tragic consequence of a fractured royal family, the once mighty Plantagenets, whose quest for power, personal betrayal, and bitter division tore England apart. A family feud turned kingdom-shattering war. These wars were not only about who would rule, but about the very soul of England itself. At the heart of it all was a throne, its legitimacy questioned, its authority constantly challenged. But in the end, the battle was not only for power, it was a war over who had the right to wear the crown, and the Lancasters and Yorks, two branches of the same family, would rip the kingdom asunder to claim it. For the next 30 years, England would be held captive by ambition, broken allegiances, and a bitter struggle for supremacy. It all began with the fragile reign of Henry VI, a king whose very existence seemed cursed. Crowned as an infant and plagued by periods of madness, Henry's reign was a tumultuous one, filled with internal strife and national instability. Henry VI, despite his claim to the throne, could not assert his rule with any semblance of strength. His weakness left England vulnerable, and the noble houses, hungry for power, quickly turned against each other. Two families, the Lancasters and the Yorks, each descended from the same royal bloodline, laid claim to the throne, but their ambitions and animosities would pull England into a bitter civil war. The Lancasters, symbolized by the red rose, were the reigning family, but their hold on the throne was slipping. Henry VI's inability to control his kingdom and his bouts of mental instability led to his growing unpopularity. At the same time, Richard of York, a man with his own strong claim to the throne, could not sit idle as his rival weakened. He saw an opportunity, and he would seize it. But the true catalyst for war would come not from York's desire alone, but from the deepening rift between the two factions. The Wars of the Roses were not just about royal bloodlines, they were about honor, pride, and the fierce desire to rule. The first battle of the Wars of the Roses, fought in 1455 at St. Albans, was not just a military confrontation, but a statement, a declaration of intent. Richard of York, leading his army against Henry VI's forces, emerged victorious, but the true cost of this victory lay in the consequences that followed. Richard did not take the crown, but his victory shattered the false peace England had lived under. For the Lancasters, the loss at St. Albans was devastating. It wasn't merely the defeat that hurt them, it was the realization that they were losing their grip on the throne. Margaret of Anjou, the Queen, would become the embodiment of Lancaster resistance, fighting fiercely to protect her husband's kingdom and, more importantly, her son's right to inherit it. The loss of St. Albans, while not fatal, was a warning shot, and Margaret would respond with unyielding rage. By 1460, the struggle had escalated. At Wakefield, Richard of York, ever the determined claimant, was killed in battle. The Yorkists' hopes seemed to fade with his death, but his son, Edward IV, would rise to the challenge. Edward was a king made of ambition and steel, and he would soon take back the crown for the Yorks. In Towton, the largest and bloodiest battle of the conflict, Edward IV's forces crushed the Lancastrian army in a snowstorm so fierce it turned the battlefield red with blood. Towton marked the peak of Edward's power, and after his victory, he would take the throne. But even in this victory, the price was clear. England had been torn apart by the very family that should have ruled it, and the battle was only the beginning of decades of shifting allegiances. But even as the Yorkists triumphed, their internal divisions were taking their toll. Edward IV's rule was marked by moments of stability, but his sudden death in 1483 created a power vacuum that would plunge England back into chaos. His son, Edward V, a young boy, was meant to inherit the throne, but the machinations of Richard III, his uncle, would forever taint the legacy of the Yorks. Richard III's rise to power, built on questionable grounds, was the final act in the tragic story of the Plantagenet dynasty. In the Tower of London, the two young princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, disappeared, their fates unknown but assumed to be the result of Richard III's ambition. His reign was short, and his claim to the throne was forever marred by the suspicion of murder. In 1485, Henry Tudor, claiming the Lancaster bloodline, would defeat Richard III at Bosworth Field, ending the Wars of the Roses. Henry Tudor's victory brought an end to the Plantagenet rule and ushered in the Tudor dynasty, forever uniting the warring houses of York and Lancaster through the marriage of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. With the Battle of Bosworth, the Wars of the Roses officially came to an end, but the price had been steep. England was left ravaged by decades of civil war, its nobility divided, its economy shattered, and its spirit broken. The Plantagenets had torn themselves apart, their ambition for the throne consuming them, and the kingdom they once ruled lay in ruins. Henry VII's Tudor dynasty would unite the two warring houses, but the scars of the Wars of the Roses would remain for generations. The battles fought, the families lost, and the bloodshed endured were all echoes of a single tragic flaw: the failure of the Plantagenet dynasty to hold itself together. The Wars of the Roses were more than just a fight for the throne. They were the story of how a dynasty, consumed by greed, pride, and betrayal, tore itself apart, leaving England a broken kingdom, struggling to find its way in the aftermath. The tragic tale of the Wars of the Roses serves as a reminder of the danger of unchecked ambition, of a family that allowed its desire for power to destroy everything it had built. The Plantagenet dynasty, once powerful and proud, was consumed by internal strife. The Lancasters and the Yorks, two branches of the same royal family, fought until nothing remained but their shattered legacy. The rose of the Plantagenets may have once bloomed in splendor, but it withered, torn by betrayal and bloodshed, leaving only the faded memories of a kingdom lost to itself. The year 1483 was supposed to mark the dawn of a new reign, a new chapter for England. Yet, in the wake of his brother's death, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, stepped into a world of political intrigue, uncertainty, and looming distrust. His ambition, his desire to secure his place in history, would lead him to the throne. But what began as a seemingly calculated ascent would soon spiral into a tragic tale of power, betrayal, and mystery. Richard III's reign, brief as it was, remains one of the most controversial in English history. A king crowned in haste, his legitimacy questioned by many, and his own decisions, shadowed by suspicion, would forever mark his legacy. And at the heart of his rise to power lies the shadow of the princes in the tower, two young boys whose disappearance still haunts the pages of history. Richard's story began not with the glittering promise of royal inheritance, but with the quiet ambition of a younger son. As a man of sharp political acumen, he had long been a loyal servant to his brother, Edward IV. But with Edward's death in 1483, England was left in turmoil. Edward's son, the young Edward V, was set to inherit the throne, but at just 12 years old, he was not equipped to rule. The kingdom needed a protector, and it was Richard who was entrusted with this role. But what seemed to be a natural progression, a protector acting on behalf of a child king, would quickly turn into something more. Richard, like many before him, saw the throne not just as an inheritance of power, but as an opportunity to secure his own destiny. Richard claimed that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, thus rendering their son's claim to the throne illegitimate. With the blessing of the Council of Lords, Richard declared himself king, taking the crown in a swift and controversial coup. Richard's rise was swift, but questioned from the beginning. His own claim to the throne, though rooted in blood, lacked the legitimacy that many believed was necessary for a monarch to be truly accepted. And as Richard looked upon the throne, his mind began to turn not just on matters of the state, but on securing his place. And this is where tragedy began to take root. The two young princes, Edward V and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury, were sent to the Tower of London for safety. But within weeks, both were out of sight, and soon out of memory. Richard, once the protector, now became the prime suspect in a dark mystery that would plague him for the rest of his reign. The question remains, what happened to the princes? Were they murdered to eliminate any threat to Richard's throne? Or did they perish due to illness, as Richard claimed? The lack of definitive proof left a vacuum, and in that vacuum, suspicion grew. Many believed Richard had ordered the murder of his nephews to ensure that no claim to the throne stood between him and his power. His rivals, and indeed many within England, had little reason to trust him. The prince's disappearance, whether directly or indirectly caused by Richard, would forever tarnish his reign and leave a permanent mark on his legacy. The mystery of the princes in the Tower is not just a matter of historical debate, it is the very essence of Richard's reign. His tragic fall from grace was shaped not just by his military defeats or political missteps, but by this one unresolved enigma. Did Richard commit murder, or was he the victim of slander, forever misunderstood? Richard's reign, marked by suspicion and internal strife, was not to last. By 1485, Richard had alienated powerful factions, and the Lancastrian claimant Henry Tudor, a distant cousin with a claim to the throne, seized the opportunity to challenge Richard. The battle that would determine the fate of England was set. The Battle of Bosworth Field. On August 22nd, 1485, the two armies met on the rolling hills of Bosworth. The Lancastrian forces, led by Henry Tudor, faced Richard's forces, which were bolstered by loyal Yorkist supporters. But Richard, despite his skill as a soldier and his determination, was outnumbered and outmatched. On that fateful day, Richard fought bravely, charging at Henry Tudor himself, hoping to end the battle by killing his rival. But fate would not allow it. Richard's forces were broken, and the king was slain. Richard III died on the battlefield, not as a conquering king, but as a tragic figure whose ambitions had failed him. His body, stripped of armor, was paraded through the streets of Leicester, a reminder of how far the mighty had fallen. He was buried hastily in an unmarked grave, his reign brought to a brutal, ignoble end. Richard's death marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty, and with it, the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. Henry VII, victorious at Bosworth, would marry Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring factions and ending the Wars of the Roses. Richard III, despite his earlier successes, would forever be remembered not as the king who secured England's future, but as the monarch whose rule was consumed by intrigue, betrayal, and the tragic disappearance of his nephews. Richard III's reign and death remain a source of endless speculation. The disappearance of the princes, the political machinations, and his brutal end at Bosworth create a tale that is both fascinating and tragic. In the end, Richard was a man of ambition, a king who sought to reshape his destiny, but whose own internal struggles, combined with the dark shadow of his actions, sealed his tragic fate. His name, forever tied to the question of the prince's death, is marked by a mystery that will never truly be solved. Richard III's life, in many ways, was a tragic paradox. A man who sought the throne with such desperation, only to be undone by the very ambition that drove him. His reign was short, but its impact would resonate throughout history, casting a long shadow over the Tudor dynasty and the England left behind. As the dust settled on the tragic collapse of the Plantagenet dynasty, one undeniable truth remained. This family, though torn apart by internal strife, had built the very foundation of modern England. From the battlefields of Agincourt to the councils of Westminster, the Plantagenets left an indelible mark on the English throne. Yet, it is in the shadows of their triumphs that we find their ultimate tragedy, a dynasty whose ambition shaped a nation, but whose own divisions would lead to their downfall. The Plantagenets were not merely rulers, they were architects. They crafted the framework of English law, laying down the principles that would govern the land for centuries. And yet, for all their achievements, their legacy is one of paradox, a family that both created and destroyed the very monarchy they had worked to build. Their reign was defined by the highs of military success and political power, but it was also marked by crushing defeats, betrayal, and a violent end. The turning point in the Plantagenet legacy came in 1215, when King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta at Runnymede. This moment, driven by the relentless demands of his barons, was a pivotal one in English history. The Magna Carta was not just a document, it was a declaration of the limits of royal power, a blueprint for a future in which the monarch was no longer an absolute ruler, but one bound by the rule of law. John's signature on the Magna Carta was a humbling moment for a king who had, up until then, ruled with unchecked authority. The Magna Carta established the foundation of common law, setting the stage for a constitutional monarchy and the rise of parliamentary power. It was the birth of the idea that no one, not even the king, was above the law. This document would go on to inspire generations of legal systems, shaping the evolution of not only England but the world. Yet, as significant as the Magna Carta was, it did not mark the end of the Plantagenet family's turbulent reign. Over the centuries that followed, the Plantagenet kings would navigate the ever-growing power of the barons and the nascent English Parliament. The struggle for dominance between the monarchy and the nobility was fierce, but the long-term result was the gradual emergence of parliamentary democracy. This battle, fought in the chambers of power and on the bloodied fields of battle, would give rise to a new political order in England. The Plantagenets may have been kings by divine right, but it was the ever-expanding role of Parliament that would ultimately shape the future of the English crown. Their inability to control this rising power, marked by struggles like the Wars of the Roses, would lead to the downfall of the dynasty, but also give birth to a new era in which monarchical power would be tempered by the voice of the people. But the Plantagenets were not only the architects of modern England, they were also its undoers, as much as they contributed to the development of English law and governance. Their internal strife, the Wars of the Roses, shattered the very dynasty they had built. This brutal conflict, fought between the Lancaster and York factions, devastated the land and left the Plantagenet throne open for the taking. The dynasty that once unified England through law and power was now a kingdom divided, and the very forces that shaped the nation's legal identity turned upon the royal family itself. The Wars of the Roses were not merely a struggle for power. They were a tragic family feud that tore apart the Plantagenet dynasty from within. Richard III, the last king of the Plantagenet line, stands as a symbol of their tragic collapse. A man who fought valiantly for his claim to the throne, yet whose internal struggles and moral ambiguities ultimately led to his downfall. The princes in the tower, whose mysterious disappearance still haunts history, encapsulate the mysteries and betrayals that define the Plantagenet legacy. As the Plantagenets tore themselves apart, so too did England's identity shift. The 100 Years' War had been a bitter and exhausting conflict with France, a struggle for supremacy that spanned over a century. But as England's French possessions dwindled, the Plantagenet kingdom began to redefine itself. England, once an extension of French royal power, would now become a more distinct entity. The loss of French territories during the war forced England to turn inward, forging a national identity that was separate from the tangled politics of continental Europe. This emerging English nationalism, fostered by the long conflict with France and the eventual collapse of the Plantagenet Empire, would shape the future of the English monarchy. The monarchy's power would continue to evolve, but it would never again wield the unchecked authority it once did. Parliamentary power and the concept of a monarch limited by law would become the cornerstone of English governance. As we reflect on the Plantagenet legacy, we are drawn to places that still stand as silent witnesses to their rule. Westminster Abbey, the burial place of kings and queens, holds the tombs of many Plantagenet monarchs, including the mighty Richard the Lionheart and the tragic Edward II. These kings, along with others of their line, left their mark on the kingdom, their legacies shaped by their actions and their failures. The abbey stands as a symbol of the Plantagenet family's power and their eventual descent into ruin. Likewise, Runnymede, where the Magna Carta was signed, remains a testament to the limits of royal power, a legacy etched in the foundation of English law. The very Magna Carta that curbed the authority of King John set the stage for the development of the English Constitution, laying the groundwork for a monarchy constrained by law and a parliamentary system that would continue to evolve for centuries. The Plantagenet dynasty is a tale of contradictions. They were kings who, in their ambition, built a kingdom, and, in their conflict, destroyed themselves. They laid the foundations of English law and parliamentary power, but their internal battles fractured the very kingdom they had created. The Magna Carta, the rise of parliamentary power, and England's growing identity as a separate entity from France are lasting legacies of this remarkable family. But their story is also a cautionary tale. The cost of ambition, the weight of power, and the tragic price of internal conflict. The Plantagenets may have been undone by their own divisions, but the England they left behind, a kingdom governed by law and a monarch limited by that law, would endure, evolving into a modern state built on the very foundations they laid. The Plantagenet legacy is one of creation and destruction, of triumphs and tragedies, and it continues to echo through the corridors of England's history. Thank you for watching this story until the end. If you found this one captivating, you're in for a treat with the next one. It's just as fascinating, if not more, than you could ever imagine. Don't miss out. Click on the image on your screen now to dive into the next adventure.